What's up guys, I'm Suman from Stein. As you know, the M1 MacBooks are really impressive laptops. But with the introduction of the M1 chips, now making a decision between the MacBook Air and the 13-inch MacBook Pro is somewhat difficult right now. And especially in India, with the prices being way higher than the actual price, making a decision here is even more difficult. So, which M1 MacBook should you buy in India? Let's find out. As you know, both these laptops have the brand new M1 chip in them. They can be configured with up to 16 gigs of RAM and with up to 2 terabytes of storage. So both look identical, right? But when you take a look at the base models of both the machines, you will notice that the base model MacBook Air has only 7 GPU cores, while the MacBook Pro has 8 GPU cores. But does that really make a difference? Actually, yes. But is that difference huge? Then no. Let me explain. Now the same scenario with the Intel MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro prove that there is a significant difference between the two machines, like a lot. But with the M1 MacBooks, it is not that big, and considering the price difference, it definitely isn't justifiable. And even in real world use, you won't see that much of a difference, especially when it comes in terms of performance between both these machines. Even if you try to edit 4K projects in these machines, which is actually possible, and you export them, you will only notice a difference of few seconds. And in my opinion, the extra few seconds isn't worth spending an extra 30k on the 13-inch M1 MacBook Pro. Other than the GPU difference here, the M1 MacBook Air and Pro are identical in all other hardware aspects. You get 8 gigs of RAM here, and as for storage, both have 256 gigabytes in the base model, and even when it comes to the selection of ports, you get the same number of USB-C ports in both the machines. So you might have a question. The M1 MacBook Pro has a fan, whereas the Air doesn't, and won't that introduce thermal limitations into the MacBook Air? And to be honest, it will, but the performance gain on the MacBook Pro again isn't that significant like how it used to be with the Intel MacBook. You will only notice the advantages of having a fan in your MacBook only if you're planning to edit 4K footage or edit really complex Photoshop or Lightroom files. And that too, you'll see the advantage of the fan. If you're planning to do all this heavy work for a very long time, the fans will help the MacBook Pro, that is the M1 MacBook Pro, have the same performance for a longer period. Whereas on the MacBook Air, due to not having a fan, it might throttle down a little, but that is a little, not that much. And to be honest, I really don't think anyone buying either the Air or Pro are planning to throw heavy workloads on them. And even if you're planning to do it, the MacBook Air gets warmer only by a few degrees, and it might even take only a few extra seconds to finish the export. So does the fan make such a huge difference that you should go spend that extra 30k and buy the M1 MacBook Pro? Actually, don't know that. So for anyone who thinks that the performance on the MacBook Pro is going to be better than the MacBook Air, please change your mind, because with the introduction of the M1 chip, Apple has closed the performance gap between these two machines, like a lot. And now purely based only on performance, if you ask me which MacBook would I go with, I would go with the Air. Because as I keep saying, the little extra performance that I get out of the Pro doesn't really justify the 30,000 price premium that I'll be paying, and moreover, those who are looking to buy any one of these two machines are mostly not planning to throw heavy workloads on them, say like 3D modeling or 8K video editing or things like that. Rather, they'll be using it for casual work and for maybe for editing pictures or for reviewing photos, maybe after a photo shoot. And for that, both these MacBooks will perform really well. Now let's talk about the displays. So with the Intel MacBook Air and the 13-inch MacBook Pro, Apple did not give the same displays for both. The Intel MacBook Air had only an sRGB display, while the Intel MacBook Pro had a display with wide P3 color gamut. Now that definitely made a lot of difference. So for example, photographers and other creative professionals would go for the MacBook Pro because that had a display which supported wide P3 color gamut, and that would definitely help them a lot with their workflow, because that is a color accurate display and photographers and creative professionals really need that. But with the new M1 MacBooks, both the M1 MacBook Air and the M1 MacBook Pro now support the wide P3 color gamut. And since the performance is not that different between both, there's no real reason for professionals to choose the MacBook Pro or the MacBook Air. The display sizes are identical at 13 inches, both have somewhat identical bezel sizes. But the only difference here is that the M1 MacBook Pro has a 500 nit display while the Air has a 400 nit display. Does that improve outdoor visibility? Yes. But does that improve the image quality? No. So if you're someone who uses their laptop quite often outdoors, then the Pro might be a good choice. Else, the M1 MacBook Air would be a great laptop to go with. Now let's talk about the battery life on these new M1 MacBooks, because based on a lot of reviews that I've seen, I think this is one feature that everyone is really impressed with. The M1 MacBook Air has a 49.9 watt-hour battery while the M1 MacBook Pro has a 58.2 watt-hour battery. After analyzing many reviews, I can for sure say that the battery life on both these machines are impressive, and on regular use, you can easily go through a day or two. But on the M1 MacBook Pro, the battery life is slightly better. Again, the difference is not that huge, so only if you really need that extra few minutes, please go with the Pro, else the MacBook Air would again be a great option. You also get two different charging adapters with these laptops, but based on some testing done by the tech chap, charging speeds are nearly identical regardless of the adapter. Now both these laptops share a lot of similarities. For example, the webcam on both these laptops are identical. Both have Touch ID sensors, and while the MacBook Pro has a touch bar, the Air doesn't have one. And to be honest, I don't think the touch bar really doesn't matter as of right now. Even when it comes to the design, both are really well-built premium laptops. But make sure you decide if you want a sleek machine like the Air or a MacBook Pro that has kind of like a fuller look to it. But at the end of the day, I really think with the introduction of the M1 MacBooks, Apple has really closed the gap between the MacBook Air and the 13-inch MacBook Pro, be it in terms of performance or features. So if you take a look at the past, with the Intel MacBook Air and the 13-inch Intel MacBook Pro, the choice was pretty easy. If you wanted a MacBook for casual use, go with an Air. But if you wanted more power and a better display and good battery life, then go with the 13-inch MacBook Pro. But now both these machines are like literally identical in so many ways that making a decision is definitely tough. So as we know, in India, the M1 MacBook Air costs 93,000 rupees, whereas the M1 MacBook Pro costs 1,23,000 rupees. And for this price, what you get on both these machines are more or less the same. The M1 MacBook Pro shines only if it is under a sustained load for a long time, because due to the thermal limitations, the M1 MacBook Air will slow down a bit. Like only a bit, and since the M1 MacBook Pro has a fan, it can keep up with the load for a longer period. Other than this, both the M1 MacBooks in my opinion are more or less the same. In India, with such a huge price premium, I would say anyone looking to buy a new M1 MacBook should go with the M1 MacBook Air, because it is literally like the M1 MacBook Pro in many ways and also 30,000 rupees cheaper, making it an attractive buy. Even if you bump up the storage on the Air to 512 gigabytes, you'll still be saving 10,000 rupees than the base M1 MacBook Pro, which in my opinion is still a better idea. But if I had to make a choice between the M1 MacBook Pro and the M1 MacBook Air, I think I would go with the M1 MacBook Air because it shares a lot of things in common with the M1 MacBook Pro. And I guess saving that extra 30k would be a much better idea, because if I spend that extra 30,000 rupees and buy an M1 MacBook Pro, the performance gain that I am going to get out of that is not that huge. And really, for 30,000 rupees, I don't think it is a justifiable buy. I'm not telling the M1 MacBook Pro is a bad device. No, I'm not telling that. But I personally think that the M1 MacBook Air is a much better buy. And for anyone who wants extra performance, I would just suggest you to wait for a few more months, because newer Pro laptops from Apple will definitely come with better CPUs and better optimization, things like that. So if you could wait a few months, then you could maybe get on with those machines. Until then, I would probably recommend the Air to many people. Anyways, I'll have the links to both these laptops in the description. Make sure you check them out. With that said, thank you for watching, and this here is Suman signing off once again. Catch you later.